Meanwhile, more than 70 people have been arrested in climate protests on the M25 again today. Many of the demonstrators, described by the Home Secretary as selfish, had been released after blocking the major motorway earlier this week before then going on to cause more disruption. Sky's Ivor Bennett has more.
This was one of several locations the demonstrators targeted this morning, either on or around the M25, here in Essex, but also in Kent and Surrey, also a location near Stansted Airport on the M11. The protesters tried to glue themselves to the road, blocking traffic on these busy interchanges, in one case also pouring paint on the road, trying to cause disruption. They're from a group called Insulate Britain, and they're demanding the government does more to make homes in Britain more energy efficient, to do more to tackle climate change. It's the third time they've demonstrated this week on the M25. What was different this time around, though, was the police response, which was noticeably swifter and also seemingly more heavy-handed, with the police forcibly removing protesters from the road, trying to keep disruption to a minimum. And that followed comments from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, last night, in which she branded the protesters as selfish. She said the guerrilla tactics used by Insulate Britain detract from their cause, and I know the public will agree that the scenes on the M25 this week were completely unacceptable. The police have our full support. They must uphold the law and take decisive action. This kind of disruption is dangerous and takes police away from communities where they are needed most. So it seems the police were following through on that warning. For their part, the protesters have said this kind of action won't stop until their demands are met, with some demonstrators here today actually coming straight from the custody centre after being released following their arrest earlier in the week. So if they're prepared to do that, I think this won't be the last protest of this kind that we see.
Well, that's got a lot of people fired up. Stay with us, because we're going to be discussing whether protests like the ones we're seeing there on the M25 get the message across. We're getting straight into discussing the climate issues of the day. That's with the Honorary President of the Black Environment Network, Judy, Ling, Wong, and Business Green's Editor-in-Chief, James Murray. Good evening to you both. Good to see you. Well, we're going to start with those protests on the M25, the country's busiest motorway, again blocked in various places for the third time this week by protesters, a group called Insulate Britain. Does this kind of action make a difference, or is it counterproductive to their cause? I should say, actually, in the last hour, we've heard from the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, who has said that we all want to live in a world that's cleaner, but this is counterproductive. This winds up motorists, safety is put at risk, and, of course, traffic standing is the worst thing for pollution. So let's get straight in there. Judy, what do you think? Priti Patel says these are selfish guerrilla tacticians. What do you reckon?
Well, of course, Extinction Rebellion does inconvenience and upset some people. But Extinction Rebellion has leaders that are very clued up about the fact that the design of a protest is about getting media and therefore public attention in order to get the message to the highest number of people. From my experience, once people see the message, they then center on the message.
What do you think about this, James? I mean, do you think Extinction Rebellion have achieved their goals?
Well, if their primary goal is to get attention and get this issue in the public eye and up the agenda, then they absolutely have by definition. I mean, what I always think is most interesting in some ways about these protests is that how inevitable they feel. I mean, if you accept that we're in the grips of a climate crisis that's getting worse and worse and could have very, very grave repercussions for humanity as a whole over the coming decades, then it was always the case that a group within society was going to be willing to take direct action to try and resolve that challenge and ensure that humanity as a whole takes action. And we've seen that with all kind of justice movements. We saw that with suffrage, we saw that with the anti-slavery movement, we saw that with civil rights. And it just stands to reason that there will be groups who are willing to break the law, get arrested, because they, in my view, rightly see that we are sleepwalking towards a climate catastrophe, and they feel the need to raise the alarm. I mean, there's kind of two debates here: whether the tactics are effective, and I think that is a legitimate debate. But the idea that these groups are going to go away, or the idea that these groups aren't acting in good faith to try and raise the alarm in the face of what could prove to be an existential threat, it just doesn't wash.
And Judy, you could say that inconveniencing the public is probably the most effective way of getting governments to respond. I mean, look what happens when the train drivers go on strike, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, but if we move away from the manner of the protest for a moment, for me this time the real drama is in the context of the simple message. Insulate Britain is a mundane, almost boring topic. The real shock for me is that this is the 21st century and we as a rich country has not yet fully insulated our social housing stock so that poorer working people can afford to keep themselves warm while we protect the planet at the same time at this critical time. You know, that this sort of climate justice dimension too has been highlighted. It's really important and really close to my heart.
Does it not also show, James, that the climate protests have evolved? Because Extinction Rebellion had pretty broad aims. It was difficult to actually pinpoint specific things that they wanted. They just wanted everything to change. But this is so specific that they could perhaps make some change here. Do you think?
I think absolutely. I think one of the legitimate critiques of Extinction Rebellion from the off was that it was too broad brushed, in some ways too ambitious. Asking to get to net zero emissions by 2030 is something that, you know, isn't going to happen. That's too big a lift. But what's interesting about this is we are now starting to see these more specific asks, and the idea of having a national programme to insulate and improve the energy efficiency of our building stock. I mean, that's supported by the Committee on Climate Change. That's supported by the CBI. That's supported by virtually every think tank and green group going that works in this space. It's an investment that would deliver massive economic benefits. It would improve health, it would cut energy bills, and it would cut carbon emissions, and it would help resolve some of these energy issues you were just talking about with energy price spikes, because we'd be using less energy in the first place. So, you know, it is a very canny ask, and it's something that the government really should be considering and prioritising if it wants to be taken seriously as a global climate leader.
And you never know. We might even get to see the heat and building strategy before COP26. Been long awaited, hasn't it? Well, let's move on now to the search for solutions. We were hearing earlier in the show about the Earthshot Prize. It is, of course, Prince William's campaign to find solutions and innovation to tackle climate change from across the world. Around half of those finalists announced today were from the global south. Well, what does that say about our search for solutions? I mean, Judy, there's a real simplicity to some of these shortlisted solutions, isn't there? I mean, Costa Rica making micropayments to people to just do their bit to protect a little bit of rainforest.
Absolutely. You know, there are things that only governments can do, and that's where all the protests and pressure comes on. But indeed, there are some things that individuals, sections of society like business, NGOs and so on can do, and they do it well because they're in touch with very local characteristics and cultural dimensions. You know, take the case of 14-year-old Phoenicia. She notices that in her country, millions of people still use street ironing services, and she's created a solar-powered ironing cart in a very sunny country to make a difference. It is amazing. And you know, and I applaud Prince William for saying that he needs to be able to look his children in the eye and say he did his bit. You know, as much as we live in a science-dominated world, it's still our emotions and our commitment to family that drives our strongest motivation to act. And to be fascinated, inspired by people that look like us, having amazing solutions.
It's important to note, though, James, isn't it, that there are no British shortlistees on that list. Many of the ideas that were shortlisted from the global south. Are we a bit arrogant in thinking that it's G7 Western nations that really have the answers here?
I think there's a risk of that. I think there's a risk of in every part of the world is that countries see the climate crisis and the sort of the clean tech revolution that will hopefully help resolve it as these kind of national, local, regional issues. But that's true everywhere. And one of the most exciting things about some of the stories we cover at Business Green is the huge breadth of innovation and investment that we're seeing in all parts of the world, including very much in these emerging markets and in the developing world. I mean, there's one of these talking points you get a lot from people who are opposed to climate action, who say, well, what about China? What about India? What about these big polluting countries that are investing in coal? Yes, they are, but they're also, in China's case, the world's biggest renewables market, the world's biggest electric vehicle market. And we are seeing some catalyzing progress from some of these countries that are, in some ways, because they don't have the legacy high carbon infrastructure, they're able to leapfrog that and deploy clean technologies at scale, at pace, ahead of some industrialized nations. So it's much more simplistic than the idea that the industrialized world is going to solve this on its own and then kind of through its largesse help developing countries. I think that, that is a borderline neo-colonialist way to see it.
Necessity is often the mother of invention, isn't it? It's been really good to talk to you both tonight. Judy, Ling, Wong and James Murray, thank you.